This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. Today we are joined by Dr. Amy Cooter. Dr. Amy Cooter is the Director of Research, Academic Development, and Innovation at the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute. She has studied nostalgic groups in the U.S. for nearly 2 decades and remains one of only a few researchers who has directly conducted interviews and attended trainings with domestic militia members. Her research aims to understand their motives for and experiences with participation in such groups. She has testified to the U.S. House Committee on Veterans Affairs hearing on the recruitment of veterans by domestic violent extremist groups and submitted written testimony to the January 6th Select Committee regarding the militia movement and its involvement in the Capitol insurrection. Amy has served as an expert consultant on a federal terrorism and a federal hate crime trial involving militia defendants and regularly consults with law enforcement agencies about militia activities. You can find her work on militias, neo-Nazis, and similar groups in a variety of academic and public outlets, and she is the author most recently of the book Nostalgia, Nationalism, and the U.S. Militia Movement. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited that you're joining us, and I want to start by just expressing my appreciation for your book. It's just so wonderfully written. I love how this book weaves together your ethnographic fieldwork with history. The way that you bring your own biography into this is really compelling in the way that it invites the reader to engage with the topic of the militia movement and militia activity in a much, much deeper way than I think a typical academic text would. Can you tell us about how your biography made you so ideally equipped and positioned to do research on this topic? Did you start graduate school thinking this would be your life's work?
I grew up in rural East Tennessee, went to undergrad with the help of a lot of financial aid at Vanderbilt, and pretty quickly realized that my background, my identity was not so similar to that of many of my fellow students at the time. When I was sitting in some of my sociology classes, and specifically in social movements as junior at the time, I kind of started to realize that my experiences were also a bit of an outlier relative to a lot of academics who were doing a variety of different research. It still tends to be the case that people study fairly exclusively movements or people that they politically and otherwise agree with, that they see themselves as being pretty similar to. I have a different perspective than a lot of the folks from my hometown on politics and some other things. I think it helps me humanize them, quite frankly, in a way that sometimes gets lost in other social science research. If we're talking about people who come from comparatively elite backgrounds, have never spent time in a rural space. And I think I just have a different framework for asking questions and listening to answers than some folks do doing similar research.
Absolutely. Well, I want to come back to questions about methods and being in the field, but I want to actually just get ourselves oriented to the militia movement. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of scale in terms of the militia right now. And when you think about measuring the militia, where do you start? Is it militia membership, militia organizations, visible activity, online activity, political openness to ideologies once espoused only by militias? It seems like there's so many ways to measure the militia movement and its importance to today's political landscape. So where do you start?
It's a good and tough question. For me, I try to focus on both groups and individuals. So units that think of themselves as militia units, as well as then people who think about themselves as militia members. But it gets complicated fast, as you said, because their political ideology, their ideas about guns specifically, and about a variety of other things have a lot of overlap with mainstream America among people who don't consider themselves part of a militia or any other group. So it's really tricky to get exact counts for that reason. It's also the case that groups like this, not just militias, but other kinds of nostalgia groups, are really hallmarked by a lot of infighting, such that even if hypothetically we know the exact number of folks we would consider militia members right now, by Monday morning we might have a vastly different answer. It's also gotten more difficult since Facebook deplatformed militias systematically. Many more of them are operating substantially more quietly than they used to and or operating exclusively in person. So it's really hard to know exactly how many groups or members we're talking about. It seems that we are in a bit of a lull, and perhaps an optimistic estimate is that we're probably dealing with tens of thousands at max nationally, as opposed to hundreds of thousands. And I think realistically, it's even less than that at this moment.
So our audience is probably not going to be aware of a really basic but crucial distinction that you draw between militias. So you talk about constitutional militias and millenarian militias. Is that pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, I lean into the millenarian part of it, but that might be my southernness.
Okay, millenarian militias. Can you unpack what the difference is between these two orientations within militias, how they draw on the Constitution, their relationship to the state, how they imagine the role of the militia differently?
Sure. So constitutionalist militias tend to fit a closer approximation of their self-description as being grown-up Boy Scouts. They focus mostly on camaraderie, on training together, including things like target shooting, but also potential survival skills. They usually meet fairly openly in terms of people know who they are, know that they're meeting. Sometimes they even advertise their events in the local area. They're not really trying to hide what they do. Their perspective is that they have a responsibility to continue maintaining these skills in the event of any number of potential disasters. One of the disasters that they're concerned about is potential infringement from the federal government. Even as most members say, the reality is this is very unlikely to ever happen. Millenarian groups are a very sharp contrast. Instead of having that more defensive posture about the government and their potential infringement, millenarian members tend to be very angry and want to actively initiate violence against the government or its representatives. They tend to be much more conspiratorial and potentially violent, and just plain match our more stereotypical image of militia members that usually end up on the news or even in fictionalized versions of what militias are and what they do.
That's super helpful. And I think it's helpful in unpacking a statement by Norm Olson, the founder of the Michigan Militia, that he actually made in advance of the inauguration of Joe Biden in 2021. And I'm just going to read that quote from him. So he says, quote, "I think the next time around," and this is referring to the January 6th insurrection, "I think the next time around, if the militia would get its act together and realize that they have a responsibility to actually stop that kind of mayhem and misbehavior, I would have liked to see more militia actually try to put down this demonstration." So in your recounting of the January 6, 2021 insurrection, you mentioned that this really reflects the penetration of militia ideology into the mainstream. So it's no longer necessary to be a militia member to be exposed to and espouse attitudes and ideologies that have been typically associated with these groups. So on the one hand, we have the mainstreaming of militia ideology. Well, on the other hand, we have this sort of old guard of the militia movement actively distancing the quote-unquote true militia movement from January 6th. So you mentioned infighting, and I was wondering if you could tell us, is this actually a division that you see play out within the militia movement right now? How does this shape the relevance of militias at this moment, particularly thinking about the upcoming 2024 election cycle?
It really is a meaningful division within the movement, and I really can't overstate the degree of variability that we can see across particular units, to some extent even across some regional variants. But the reality is, many militia members were not happy to see January 6th. They're not big fans of Joe Biden, but they believe that the Constitution should be followed. They did not believe the rumors of the election being stolen or somehow manipulated inappropriately. And they really believed that it was bad for America as well as bad for the militia movement to have something like January 6th happen. This division tends to follow pretty closely on that constitutionalist versus millenarian line, where some of those millenarians actually did think it was a good idea and wished that January 6th had been successful.
I want to get in a little bit more into what transpired during 2020. So in your book, you talk about this year as, this period where we see this surge in militia activity. And it seems to be a tipping point, both in terms of increased activity, but also shifts in kind. You write about in your book about watching the militia movement at this moment transform. And I quote, you say, "I witnessed this playing out in real time among some of the groups I follow, and it was, to be frank, frightening to see this shift happen." Can you unpack what happens in 2020 and what this shift is that you found so frightening?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of things that came to a head in 2020. Many people had anxieties about COVID in its own right. Many people had anxieties about various different efforts to control COVID's spread, which were easily interpreted as government overreach, government overstepping by folks who were already predisposed to thinking that way. Of course, there were economic hits as a result of COVID and some of the surrounding processes that make people anxious too. And I think that it's really, really important to understand what a direct role President Trump played in not just making those particular fears seem relevant and perhaps even bigger than they actually were, but also stoking fears about immigration and national identity. And it really just became a cauldron of issues that people could draw upon, even if they didn't care about every single one of those underlying things. They all could kind of agree, at least in principle, that we were headed in a terrible direction and they needed to do something. Trump positioned himself almost as a savior for some of these underlying processes. And so many people supported him, did not want to have Biden or anybody else replace him in office as a result. What I personally saw playing out, especially in social media spaces, was broader narratives about all of those particular issues. And one of the most stark cases, I think, was a man I have followed for a long time, actually since the time that I did field work in Michigan, where he used to openly mock conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists, like actively would talk about how ridiculous they were and how illogical they were. And instead, he started sharing some QAnon adjacent conspiracism on his Facebook page specifically. I actually talked to him about it. And he was like, well, I don't really think this is true, but you never know. Maybe we should think about it just in case. And he didn't include those caveats, of course, as he was posting these theories. And over time, he posted more and more, and he had a pretty big following, and other people would share them and then, do their own, quote, research and fall further down that rabbit hole. And it was really rapid how that shift happened, not just for him, but for many of the people kind of surrounding him, in a way that made them much more prone to millenarian style of thinking.
Yeah, I was really surprised to read about Norm Olson, again, the founder of the Michigan Militia. In his response to the Oklahoma City bombing, he came up with this completely preposterous conspiracy theory that somehow this involved Japan. And I suggest listeners, if they want to learn more, they should read your book, Amy. And the surprise in reading this was not the conspiracy itself, because, from the perspective of 2024, utterly unremarkable that there would be a conspiracy theory that would explain an event like this. But what was surprising was the reaction of the militia community, which was basically to ridicule Olson. They saw Olson's claims as ridiculous and they debunked them. And today, false flag arguments, obviously, as you just mentioned, are wildly popular in many conservative circles. So you mentioned Trump, you mentioned social media. Is that what you would see as the big differences? Is it also political siloing that's part of this, rampant partisan moment that we're in? I would love to hear more about how believing in conspiracy theories has shifted from something, even among militia members, from something that makes you look like a dupe to something that actually makes you look like a critical thinker. Please unpack this for us.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, and I'm frankly not sure I have a perfect answer, but you're right to contrast that to the response that many members had about Olson's claims of the Oklahoma City bombing in the 90s, particularly because the militia of the 90s as a whole was pretty invested in conspiracism. So it was kind of fascinating how quickly they rejected that and really turned against their leader in some ways. Today, I do think social media plays an enormous role, right? We can all get online and see crazy things, and maybe today even see AI generated things. And if we don't have the motivation or the skills, we may not dig a whole lot deeper. And through repeated exposure to the same kinds of narratives, maybe we start to believe them, even if at the beginning we didn't, right? It's just from the exposure we think that really matters for gradually sucking people down this path. I also think that we've had conspiracism enter mainstream politics in a way that we hadn't seen for a while. I don't think it's completely unprecedented, but I don't think we had seen it at this level for a while. We saw it from Trump, we've seen it from Congress, we've seen it from other venues that legitimize these theories in a way that makes them harder to confront with the truth, especially if they're being echoed in these other quarters.
So let's go back to the 1990s, where you outlined the birth of the modern militia movement, basically in 3 acts. So Ruby Ridge in 1992, Waco, Texas in early 1993, and then the Brady Bill in late 1993, which gets passed which goes into effect in 1994. All of these events were linked together with a profound skepticism of federal action. And even though it seems like it was the least extraordinary of the 3, you actually argue that it was the Brady Bill that provided the tipping point, both in terms of affirming these suspicions regarding the federal government, but also bringing in a wider swath of people, gun owners, into the militia fray. So this idea that the Second Amendment protects the First is now so widespread that it actually appeared on a gown recently at CPAC, at the Conservative Political Action Committee. This is widely mainstream discourse in terms of the conservative movement today. Can you walk us through why the Brady Bill was so critical, not just for sparking the modern militia movement, but also transforming gun culture and gun politics more broadly?
Sure. I think that the 2 preceding events, we can't leave them out of the equation. So both Ruby Ridge and Waco, in short, were events where many people interpreted government overreach into private civilian lives, not just militias, not just conservatives. We had a very strong sort of negative national reaction to those particular events, especially coming so close in time together. I think for the militia movement and for a lot of just gun owners, having the Brady Bill come so quickly after those 2 events was interpreted as further overreach within the militia communities. Specifically, some folks actively thought that the Brady Bill was intended to make it easier for the government to come in and potentially take you hostage or murder you from their perspective if they didn't agree with your religious outlook or the way that you were raising your family. Outside of those militia communities, I don't think the rhetoric necessarily took it that far, but that's when I personally, within the militia movement, have seen a lot of the discussion of the slippery slope argument come to being where, if we let this particular law go through, well, who knows what they'll pass, we'll lose all of our access, we'll lose all of our gun rights. And I think that became just a very galvanizing moment for not just militias, but for the NRA, for other folks who really saw themselves as invested in that gun owner identity, particularly as it potentially relates to masculinity or their understanding of what it meant to be an American.
You have one very clear-cut bar for militias. If they don't involve regular firearms training and activity, then they aren't militias. So this means that a lot of extremist groups like the Proud Boys, as well as what we could call lone wolf actors or lone wolf terrorists, are not best understood as part of the militia movement as you define it. So on the one hand, as we read the stats on the public's growing acceptance of political violence in the U.S., which has been increasing over the last couple of years, it would be easy to consider the centrality of firearms training as one reason why militias are just so concerning. Yet your actual ethnographic windows into militia activities actually shows the opposite. You show that an emphasis on firearms training is actually an indicator that a particular militia is less likely to pose a threat. Can you explain what might seem like a paradox to an outsider looking in?
Yeah, it is complicated if you're on that outside perspective and don't necessarily understand how militias themselves think about firearms. The reason, let me take a step back in your framework here, because I think it's really important to unpack this. The reason that I say that firearms training is central to my definition of militias, which is a little stricter than some people use, is because of just how much they value firearms and the Second Amendment more broadly. Like, that is their reason that they do what they do, which separates them then from some other groups who may even casually, occasionally incorporate firearms into training, or have individual members who make different decisions about whether they're armed at a protest or something. But it's not the reason that brought them all together in the first place. And I think we have to understand that kind of from a top-down perspective to understand really what their values and motives are, as well as to understand what their likely behaviors are in certain contexts. And from what I have personally witnessed firsthand, groups that really follow that framework respect firearms. They understand that they are dangerous weapons. And part of their training includes various different safety regimens that everybody who is on the site, whether they're using firearms or not, is expected to know and follow. And that means that they're regularly reinforcing both the utility, but also the danger of firearms. For militia groups that don't necessarily have the training and they just go out and regularly kind of haphazardly target shoot or do other things, it's almost more like an expression of their anger, and the safety piece of it falls by the wayside, which to me is kind of a broader indicator of how they're devaluing safety, how they're maybe taking the danger for granted. And we've seen that play out with some of the groups that have actually been arrested and charged with various crimes. We've been able to look back at their past history and seen that many of their firearms practices have not followed the more, let's say, ideal model of focusing on safety and control during those training exercises.
You also describe firearms training as spaces, as you write, of recreation and camaraderie rather than anger and anxiety. At other points in your book, you also talk about militias themselves as spaces for members who are mostly white men to manage their emotions, such as loneliness. We know there is an epidemic of loneliness among men, especially as men age and they have fewer and fewer close friendships. So it's easy to get lost in the political rhetoric, but from this vantage point, it seems like militias are doing something for the men involved that gets lost in the phrase right-wing extremism. Can you talk about these deeper socio-emotional functions the militia might be playing and how masculinity fits into this picture?
Yes, and I think I want to make sure that we're clear that within this conversation, I'm mostly talking about the constitutionalist groups here. I think there are socio-emotional functions that happen within the millenarian framework, but they can look a little bit different as those negative emotions and feelings are kind of fostered. But within those constitutionalist groups, a lot of those men have military experience, are conscious of having lost a version of camaraderie that was very present for their military experience, and are kind of looking for a surrogate for that. When they join a militia group, many of them feel like this is their opportunity not only to share some of those skills, but potentially to be respected by some of the folks who do not themselves have that military background. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric about how military veterans are connected to extremism, even though we know that there's some issues potentially with those data and with those claims. And some of the folks I've encountered are specifically kind of reacting against that in an interesting sort of way, doing something that they actually feel like is patriotic with people who largely agree with them on a political basis. I personally have seen many men specifically go to these spaces, talk about how relaxing it was, how that was their favorite part of their week or their month to be able to do their units training, because it was just something outside of the norm of their usual day-to-day grind. It was interesting when I very first went to some of these fieldwork experiences, just how the vibe, obviously the particular actions were different, but how the vibe generally felt so much like some social groups that men in my home community belonged to that were about very different things, scuba diving or church activities or other things, but that kind of made it an interesting space for men to be engaged around things that they cared about. I think that militia outlets are not the only way for us to accomplish that, but I agree with you. I think that it is one indication that some men are looking for how they should be men in our current framework, and how we've had some shifts in what it actually means to be this traditional man. And that alone may be pushing some folks to look for a group like this to have that kind of outlet.
I think that brings us right to your central concept in the book, which is nostalgia. I love your metaphor of tree branches. to reconcile how the modern American conservative movement, which is made up of many, many divergent factions, becomes this coherent political force. So you talk about nostalgia as the soil in which all these different trees of American conservatism grow. And when the political winds blow right, the branches get tangled up. So I think this is so brilliant and so illuminating. But here's what I want to ask. I think there are several other candidates that often get brought up by scholars that could serve as the soil, that are used to make sense of how the conservative establishment congeals. So I'm thinking particularly of other explanations such as white supremacy, resentment, status threat, anti-elitism. I'm curious what nostalgia gets us that these alternative frames don't. Why nostalgia?
Well, I think a lot of those alternative frames are commonalities across some of these groups, but they're not nearly as ubiquitous in my observations. So specifically with white supremacy, I want to be clear with what we mean by that, because there's been some disclarity, I think, in the social media space, in particular in recent years, right? White supremacy is a system that overall benefits white folks, and people can participate in that, benefit from that, even without their conscious awareness. But we want to be careful and not conflate that with overt racism, which sometimes happens when we're talking about groups like this. And from what I have observed within the constitutionalist militias, overt racism is not the reason they do what they do. It's not something that is a motivating factor either at the group level or very commonly at the individual level. I saw some individual people I would consider to be racists who were fairly quickly pushed out of groups like this because, interestingly enough, most constitutionalist militia folks like to think of themselves as egalitarian and as really truly supporting what America is supposed to be for everybody. Now, that said, that doesn't mean they don't have stereotypes or don't have blind spots, just like a lot of white Americans who aren't part of militia groups. But I think there's a fundamental difference between somebody who joins a group because they're worried about the government or because they're worried about their gun rights versus they join another group because they hate people who aren't white. And I think we have to be really clear about what our language is for that example, but for some other things that make it, in my opinion, more of a real commonality across a variety of different groups, as opposed to potentially having a little less selection in some cases.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you make a really clear distinction between white supremacy versus white supremacists. And you trace this out actually over the course of the history that you lay out on the modern militia movement. And there was one story in particular that stuck out to me, which is the story of Tom, who is a delivery driver that you interviewed. I found his words really revealing, as well as the trajectory of his politics. So basically, you have him talking about the Constitution. You quote him saying that, basically this is like this immaculate document. And yeah, there was this clause about enslaved people who are 3/5 people, and that's problematic. So he recognizes that. But it's kind of a side note. It's not, it's just an asterisk on his overall endorsement of the Constitution. But then what you do is trace out his political attitudes after that. You talk about how he becomes more and more vocal and radical, more openly racist in his views, especially as Trump rises to power. And I think a lot of academics and outsiders to the militia movement would read that and say, okay, so he was just really a racist all along. But that's not quite how you want us to read this. Can you tell us how we should be reading Tom?
I think Tom and people like him have the same sorts of exposures that we all do to cultural and social stereotypes that are still very prevalent and that reflect negative ideas about people of color and about other groups. I think most people actually have to be fairly incentivized to think about those stereotypes and try to unpack them and not be influenced by them. Most of the scholarship on race and racism really affirms that. And I think for a lot of white folks, especially white men of his generation, that incentive wasn't always there. Sometimes the opportunities weren't always there. Even when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan and I would teach classes there, I had multiple students who in the state of Michigan said that they had never even seen a Black person in person before they came to college. And so I think we want to remember that a lot of folks who study guns or academics more broadly may have on average different experiences than the average white American, right? And so we want to understand that different influences around us, say Trump or politics or economics or whatever, can potentially push us in a more open trajectory or a more radicalized and problematic trajectory. To me, this is really important because it helps us understand that process. It helps us identify variables that maybe we want to address as a society and prevent some of that spread. But even on the individual level, I think it yields some insights into potential interventions, conversational points that we can adopt to help people kind of break that cycle, at least, thinking optimistically here and hypothetically. I personally have to latch onto those moments of optimism within our field. Otherwise, it just gets to be too much.
Yeah, so I feel like there's a lot of different directions we could go now. But you know what? I think I want to talk a little bit more about nostalgia. And can you just define nostalgia as it works for you in your analysis?
I forget exactly how I phrased this in my book. You can edit that part out. But basically, when we're talking about nostalgia, we're thinking about positive feelings of the past, even though the past, as people imagine it, may not have truly existed that way. It may be based on stories or mythology or just inflated general feelings of what we have experienced or what we think other people have experienced.
Yeah, I totally know that feeling of I wrote this and yet
How exactly did I say
what did I
this?
say? And am I going to contradict myself? Okay, I'm going to go to this question. So at the end of your book, you provide a couple of examples of a surprising openness among at least some militia members to rethink presumptions regarding hegemonic masculinity and white supremacy. I was wondering, with these examples in mind, if you could tell us how we should productively engage nostalgia, push back on nostalgia, think about nostalgia that drives militia ideology and the broader conservative movement. And in this question, I'm particularly interested in this notion of reflective nostalgia that you reference at the end of your book. I think there are a lot of people who are quite suspicious of any attempts to valorize the past, but it sounds like you have a more nuanced take here.
There's good research, mostly from psychology, some from social psychology, that indicates that nostalgia in and of itself may not be a bad thing, that it probably has positive socio-emotional functions, both for individuals and for community building. But I think that what the folks who have talked more about reflective nostalgia mean is that, it's okay to have these warm, fuzzy feelings about our past, but let's not just stop there. Let's use our highly developed human brains and also think a little bit more carefully about whether those feelings are truly rooted in reality, and think about the accuracy and the scope of what we're relying on. One of the things that I talk about in my book and that I really think is a relevant consideration here is how still today our U.S. public education system doesn't necessarily do a phenomenal job educating about our history of slavery or Native American genocide, or even the atrocities that were part of the civil rights movement. A lot of kids go through the system with the impression that the United States has always been some kind of moral leader, and we don't necessarily realize our foibles. And as a result, we don't always realize that it's not been as easy a road for many people as it has been, statistically speaking, for white men. If we don't have that history, if we don't have those realizations, it becomes a lot more difficult to talk about ongoing problems of race and other kinds of discrimination today.
One of the aspects of this book and your work in general, really, that I very much appreciate is that you don't let your reader off easy. So it would be so easy for you to do this work and sort of play off militias as fringe and isolated, as radical. You really draw out how militias are actually, for example, very much interested in impacting politics and society. You point out, as you just did, that many of the criticisms that are leveraged against militias can just as be easily leveraged, for example, against academics. Here, I'm particularly thinking about how you write about your experiences of sexism within the academy versus fieldwork. We are living in an increasingly partisan political environment, the kind of place where nuance goes to die. So why is it so crucial to get these nuances right, both as academics, but also as participants in American democracy? Why is intellectual humility so important at this moment?
I think it's always important, but I think it is especially important right now. I mean, from an academic perspective, I don't think we can claim we're doing science ideally according to the scientific method unless we're fully presenting the case. If we're only presenting a biased perspective or only presenting some of our analysis, I don't think we're doing anybody any favors. And I think that extends to our broader political environment, broader society, because nuance is really crucial, I think, for maintaining not just humility, but also humanity and understanding that people are complex and complicated. And like it or not, we have to find some points of commonality and sort of take it back to some shared elements if we want to productively move forward on a lot of these conversations.
You testified in front of Congress in 2021. And I highly, highly, highly recommend our listeners go and listen to and watch that testimony. In that, you describe your background as a gun owner who grew up in Appalachia before getting into your research on the militia movement. One of the elected officials, I believe his name was Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, I think he must have had his speaker off because after you say all of this and you brilliantly lay out your background, your research, he basically dismisses you as an academic talking head. Now, first of all, I just want to say that your response to him was incredible. And again, listeners, please go watch this. It's amazing. But I want to know just how you've dealt with this perception of academics, not just in terms of sharing your expertise with the wider world, but also when you were actually conducting your research. How did you deal with people's suspicions about your motives as an academic from Ann Arbor?
That talking about my background is helpful. I do think that I'm better able to navigate both worlds than some folks are. I've also just recognized for a long time I'm never going to make everybody happy. And if I'm kind of making some liberals mad and some conservatives mad at the same time, I'm probably roughly where I need to be, analytically speaking. I've just tried to call things as I see them to be as accurate as possible, and people will just have to take that however they take that.
It was pretty harrowing to read about your almost encounters with the Hutari. So right as they were planning an attack on law enforcement in 2010, you were in the field. And in fact, you were thinking about, you were almost going to maybe make contact with them. And it was actually other militia members who basically told you, like, don't do it. Stay away. You're going to be in danger. And I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit about your own positionality as a white woman and how that may have made you both vulnerable in some ways, but also protected in others. And if you can pull from that any advice for researchers looking to enter this field who might have concerns about safety.
I think it really helped me to be a white woman doing this research. Most of the groups are filled with white men. Being a woman in this space allowed me to go in and ask questions that certain men would not have been able to do because they would have been expected to have more knowledge about firearms or about other things. Sometimes I would ask questions that I knew the answer to, but it's still better to get our participant responses and data. And I could do things like that more easily. Most of the men I encountered also had at least some version of chivalry in the background. And so after I got into the field and got to know these folks, I had fewer concerns about my safety, as I mentioned. And as you mentioned, some of them even tried to look out for me in certain circumstances, which was helpful. Before I knew them very well, though, and of course, as I was planning this research, I had lots of anxieties about going and not knowing exactly what I would find or the character, the people I would find. And I think for folks doing any work remotely like this, it's very important to develop a robust safety plan, but also know, especially if you're going out in the woods in the middle of nowhere where you may or may not have cell service, that there's only so much you can do. Just to give a quick example, part of my safety plan was I always had at least two people who knew roughly where I was going and what time I should be back. And if they hadn't heard from me from a certain time, they had instructions to contact law enforcement with that information. Fortunately, that never happened, but it's that kind of consideration that you really have to plan for, because even today, I don't think IRBs or most other institutional functions are really familiar or equipped with how to help researchers protect themselves.
Yeah, I'm curious. You've been obviously contacted by public defenders, by law enforcement for your expertise. Have you been ever contacted by an IRB in this regard? Because I feel like you are the person they would need to talk to navigate so much of this.
You know, I haven't. I've talked to a lot of academics, but to my knowledge, nobody's actually been serving on IRB boards at that time.
Yeah, so I did want to actually ask you about your sort of philosophy on public sociology and, sharing your expertise. You talk about your engagement with law enforcement. You talk about supporting public defenders of militia members charged with crimes. You write about all of this in your book. And so I imagine, given that it seems like you are willing to share the expertise with whoever may need it, whoever is calling you up. Or is that true, I guess, is the first question. How you engage in public sociology, and what's your broader philosophy of public sociology?
I honestly don't know why sociologists do what they do unless they're thinking about public consumption, because we're dealing with people, we're dealing with issues that dramatically impact people's lives. And I don't think we should be siloing that behind pay-for-play journals, quite frankly, especially if we're dealing with groups that are potentially engaged in violence or some kind of public harm. I really think there's an ethical responsibility to share that as appropriate. It's also not super easy, right? Because depending on who we're talking about, where we're talking about, law enforcement may not be the most trusted source for some communities. And yet, if hypothetically a researcher has some knowledge of a specific harm brewing, we don't necessarily have a lot of societal alternatives beyond law enforcement right now to talk about those things with.
I'm curious if you've had any ethical dilemmas with, I'm thinking particularly of public defenders who are supporting militia members charged with crimes. Have you had any instances where you have declined those requests for your expertise?
Yes, there was one case in particular where the cases I talk about in the book, there are public defenders who contacted me specifically requesting understanding of what militias are and how they usually function. I've been contacted in another case by a defender who really wanted me to advocate on behalf of his client, and that was not something I was comfortable with.
So that brings us to law enforcement approaches to militias. And some people think the answer is super simple, just ban militias. But just as with banning guns, it's never that simple. Can you tell us how and why this approach really misses the mark in terms of what kinds of threats militias may pose and also what the appropriate role of law enforcement should be?
This is a tough question too, but just as you mentioned, just because we ban something doesn't mean it's going to go away or even respond the way we ideally want it to. Many militia members aren't breaking any laws, they aren't acting in harmful ways, and if we try to implement a lot of legislation or a really strong law enforcement approach to them, all that's going to do is make them mad and make their supporters and their family members mad. It's actually going to make the units larger. It's going to make their anger grow. And it's probably going to have the exact opposite effect of what that effort would be trying to accomplish. Law enforcement, I think, usually best benefit from knowing which units are active in the area, having enough contacts, whether it's face-to-face or just knowing folks in the community, to have an understanding of whether they're dealing with a constitutionalist versus militarian group and develop a strategy from there.
And when you talk about law enforcement approaches to militia activity, I wonder how you deal with a longstanding, deep-seated, obvious double standard. We know historically organized armed Black groups, for example, have been subject to repression, surveillance, infiltration, while organized armed white groups have been ignored or even emboldened by law enforcement. Can law enforcement be the answer here, or can it be the answer alone?
It certainly can't be the answer alone, but I think that we can't take them completely out of the equation simply because a lot of the variables that push us towards having U.S. domestic militias are complex and rooted in history and aren't going anywhere anytime fast. So unfortunately, we need that law enforcement presence to do something about the groups that do end up plotting violence or other kinds of harm.
And looking forward into the future, into the crystal ball that we can all see so clearly, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, there's parts in the book where you kind of mention, the no fucking around coalition. So the growth in Black militias. We know, for example, that there's been an increase in LGBTQ gun ownership alongside calls and actions aimed at protecting LGBTQ spaces with arms. I'm wondering from your research what you see as the breakdown. Is there a shift toward militias becoming a much more diverse phenomenon? What does this look like to you?
Yeah, I wish I had that crystal ball, but I think that I think we're going to see a lot more armed groups. Whether they consider themselves militias, whether they regularly gather and train, and this fit my definition, is a little bit more of a question. I don't have quantitative data on this. If anybody does, please let me know. But I suspect we have seen a growth in John Brown type shooting clubs, ones that see themselves as more on the liberal end of the spectrum. I think that there are going to be many groups who advocate being armed for self-defense in the home, maybe where it's legal for protests and other things, in a way that is generally increasing, rather, the diversity of who is armed in potentially public spaces. That said, I don't know exactly what that means. We're worried, of course, that some of that might come to a head in 2024 as there are different protests and likely debates over election sites and gatherings that are related to other things that are kind of hot button social issues. Whether that means that people will be more likely to show up armed as counter protesters and thus more likely to engage in some kind of violence remains a question.
Yeah. I want to end with your emphasis on community level organizations as a meaningful way to maybe not move beyond, but move alongside a law enforcement centered approach. I don't think you would use the word abolitionist to describe this, but it sounds a little abolitionist. Like, how can we put the power to address these kinds of issues back into the community and revitalize community ties and make that a source of dealing with the kinds of issues that militias in their most violent form may pose. And so I appreciate this so much because I think it brings us back to the reality that the state, whether it's law enforcement or policymakers, is really only as good as the people that empower the state. And so developing the kind of civic capacities at the community level is probably going to go much further in terms of addressing potential dangers of militia activity. And I was just wondering because, you write about this in the finale of your book. And so, it's always like, tell us more. Do you have examples of this in action, or can you tell us a bit more about how you envision this kind of intervention?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach, right? I think that communities maybe would vary in terms of what would best benefit them. But where I am in Nashville, for example, there's been a longstanding community organization that basically does work outside of the police and local government because they've traditionally had to. They largely serve the Black community in the northern part of the city that's been neglected in various different ways by our taxation, by other things that have benefited other folks. And I think that as a general rule, they've fostered a whole lot of cohesion, a whole lot of trust, not just with Black families, but beyond to other neighbors and immigrant communities too. And so I think that's kind of a baseline model. Just having that trust, having that dialogue is a very important foundational step. And I kind of stopped short of saying this in the book because my focus by that point is a little bit different. But honestly, I think if we had more of that kind of available present community gathering, that might be something that would be a reasonable alternative for some people who seek out militias, because that's really all they're after in the first place, is their idea of community service and the camaraderie that follows.
So as we get deeper and deeper into the 2024 election cycle, what is on the top of your mind in terms of what to look out for with regard to militia activity and the militia movement?
It's another one of those questions where I wish I had the crystal ball for sure, but I am right now paying close attention to how many of these groups are following Trump's process through the legal system. Many of them are kind of waiting to see what happens with him in his various cases. In some cases, they're waiting to see whether they want to support him again. In some cases, they're waiting to see whether they need to stop another steal or somehow fight what they perceive to be a corrupt system that's treating him unfairly. And I think that as we get closer to November, those will be important flashpoints. I also expect that we'll continue to see activity more at the local level around things like school board actions or around sites that are related to the election. So not necessarily just voting locations themselves, but potentially places that have historically received a lot of polling or a lot of canvassing. I think there might be people who intentionally are trying to suppress some of those actions, as well as people who believe they're just monitoring things and making sure things are happening fairly, but because they're armed, they're out of place, are also having a potentially suppressive effect.
Okay, big picture questions. What's the question we need to be asking about guns right now, but aren't?
I think one of the things that we need to consider is that we're in a society that has shown a lot of inertia towards anything resembling gun control. So I think we need to do a better job of considering how to have conversations about making the weapons that are out there safe instead of necessarily focusing on rolling back access and taking things away from people who already have them, just because that's an easier starting point.
And what are you reading now?
So I have to confess that I have actually not cracked it open yet, but I am very anxious to start Drew McKevitt's Gun Country. Very excited to read a little bit more about the history of how all of this has developed and led us to the point we're at now.
It's an excellent book, and actually he will be joining us on this podcast. So listeners can read your book, Amy. They can read Drew's book, and they can listen to all the authors on the podcast. So awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I am so happy that you do the work you do. We are so lucky to have you in academia and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns and Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.